Welcome to the world of Tash. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about where's that line between pain, punishment, and funishment. So let's get straight into it. Now, one of the topics that people are probably most curious about when I talk about my profession is how does someone like pain? So there's two types of pain when we're talking BDSM. I like to talk about the physical pain aspect of it, but there's also an emotional pain aspect of it. So let's firstly talk about physical pain. And first we need to kind of understand a little bit about what pain is. So most people think the more pain you're subjected to, the better your threshold will be, which actually isn't correct. Basically, what happens, for example, when we get hit, is that the nerve travels up to our brain that, oh, I've been hit. And our brain interprets this as, I'm meant to feel pain from this. So it's not necessarily just being hit repeatedly that your threshold is going to change at all. What people who are pain thresholding training, you might want to say, is what they're training is the way their brain interprets pain. So that when they're hit, their brain doesn't think, ouch, this hurts, I need to have X reaction. But their brain is trained to think something else, whether that be pleasure, whether that be emotional release for some. So I think just understanding a little bit more about what pain is very important when it comes to BDSM. Also, your genetic makeup is going to have some sort of influence on the amount you can feel pain as well. But there's also a largely mental aspect to it as well. So I want to emphasize that having a higher pain threshold does not mean you are any better or any worse when it comes to BDSM. A lot of people have this belief that they need to have a higher and higher pain threshold. And I just always remind people, you're not in competition with anyone, and that includes yourself. So it doesn't matter where you start, where you end up to. It's your journey, and it's how you want to build on your practice. Now, I have clients who are very heavily into pain, and they like hard pain into the point that it might leave marks. But I also have clients who like a little bit of pain, but they don't like marks. And then I also have clients who like no pain whatsoever. So pain doesn't necessarily equal BDSM. So I think that can sometimes be a bit of a misconception out there, that to be good at BDSM, you need to have a high pain threshold. Another thing to think about with pain is that it's not just physical pain that you might be subjected to practicing BDSM. There might be emotional pain. And I think a really good example of this in BDSM is when it comes to humiliation. So humiliation is a practice, which you can probably guess is being humiliated. And again, I break this down into two categories when I'm talking with subs or clients. The first category is what I call humiliating acts. And the second category is what I call personal humiliation. So humiliating acts are things like being a dog or being made to eat out of a dog bowl or put on makeup when you don't want to. So that could be considered humiliating acts. I, for example, have a client who likes to be forced to dress up as a woman, a full face of makeup or wig, get collared, and we walk down one of the main streets of Sydney. And his kink is that people are laughing at him. And as I'm walking him down the street, he wants me to say, like, look at all these people laughing at you. They think you're so pathetic doing this. So that's a humiliating act, mixed in with a bit of personal humiliation because I'm saying something mean to him as well. But that act of him being forced to walk down the main street of Sydney and have everyone looking at him and laughing at him is something that he really enjoys. So as I said, the other side of it is personal humiliation. And that's when you're making degrading comments against someone's personality or their appearance or who they are. So, for example, a very well-known one in BDSM is what we call SPH, because we love an acronym, which is small penis humiliation. It's a very common kink of people's, and it's basically where I will stand in front of my sub, or they'll be restrained or whatever position they're in, and make fun that they have the smallest penis that I have ever seen, and there is nothing in this world that that penis could do to make anyone happy. Or I degrade them in their intellect. Some people like to be called stupid or dumb. There's a whole range, but that type of humiliation is more aimed at them as a person rather than them doing something that they might find humiliating. And it's very important that when you have a sub or a client who says, I enjoy humiliation, that you don't just say, okay, cool, and run into your scene and think, okay, here's some humiliating things I can do. It is very important for mental safety and mental health to define what type of humiliation they mean and to define the limits of that humiliation. I would never go into humiliation into a scene unless it was consented to prior. You can do a lot of damage to someone if you just leap into it without consent. So you might be thinking, why are these people subjecting themselves to pain? Well, again, like in most things in BDSM, there are a myriad of reasons. But if you look at my personal experience, along with a lot of research that's been done, is you've kind of got a few main groups of why people practice BDSM. I've mentioned before, they think up to 40% of people use it as a stress reliever. There's also people who do use it as sexual play, so it's something that sexually arouses them. You've also got people who said there's just an intrinsic motivator, that there's just something inside of them that has felt drawn to BDSM, but they don't actually know why. You've also got a group of people who you'd call extrinsically motivated, and that does include people who might have past trauma, but it's not always past experiences in a traumatic sense. It can be when people have had past trauma and they use BDSM, as I have mentioned previously, to rewrite the script of that trauma and actually work through it. But it can also be someone that's had a childhood experience. For example, I remember one research saying that when they were a kid, they used to love playing, I think it was pirates or something, and they used to get tied up. And ever since then, their kink for being tied up has eventuated. So that's something, but that's a positive connotation from a childhood experience that has brought them into their current BDSM practice. So there can be a myriad of reasons of why people practice BDSM. Pain, as I said, is only one aspect. And as I said before, it doesn't matter what end of the scale you're on. You're not in competition with anyone, and especially not with yourself. So I think a nice little tie-on from pain is people often associate pain with punishment. As we've discovered, pain is not necessarily always a punishment for someone. And this is when we can talk about something called punishment. So basically, punishment is when you're giving someone a punishment that they enjoy. So for example, someone who enjoys corporal punishment, which corporal punishment is like spanking, flogging, hitting, those types of impact play. So say they've done something that's say wrong in a scene, and by wrong I mean they've gone against the agreed protocols and the way that you play or the way that you've instructed them to behave, and you want to punish them. If you then spank them 10 times and they're into corporal punishment, that kind of goes against the concept of what a punishment should be. A punishment, remember, is meant to deter someone from an unwanted behavior. So if you start spanking someone who's into corporal punishment, it's not exactly going to deter them from doing the unwanted behavior. It's going to do the opposite effect. So a concept that was created in BDSM was the term punishment. that when you're kind of doing a behavior to someone in the kind of probably mock punishment play, which is fine, but it is considered a punishment. It's not an actual punishment. Now, when we come to punishment in BDSM, as I said, the aim of punishment is to deter unwanted behavior. So you need to think about this too, because I can't just decide what someone's punishment is. A punishment is an activity that is not preferred but still consented to. And that's really important. So it's an activity you've previously negotiated, the submissive has given their consent, but it's an activity they prefer not to do. So when I take in new clients or new subs, this is actually one of the first things I ask them is, what is an activity you consent to but do not prefer? Because that will give me an idea of how I can punish them. I can't just decide in the middle of a session if they've done something against our agreed protocol to start spanking them if they've never given me consent to spank them. So I'll give you a really good example though of sometimes how hard it can be. As I mentioned, the dom that trained me, she had her personal sub, and I mentioned that he was into pretty much everything of BDSM you could imagine. So we were at lunch one day and we're sitting there and I'm like, how do you punish him? I mean, he enjoys everything. And she said, and I'll never forget, sometimes I just leave him there and don't touch him. And I'm like, that is such a good punishment because he gets off on everything. So by doing nothing is actually this guy's punishment. It was like mind-blowing, that moment for me. Another one she actually said for him, because one thing he wasn't as into but gave consent to was a servitude sub, which is someone that likes to perform like serving acts. So like cooking dinner or cleaning your house. So that type of submissive. That was an activity he would consent to, but it wasn't really his thing. So when she needed to punish him, what she would do is tie one of his hands behind his back and make him cook her dinner. So you can actually get really creative with punishments. They don't have to involve pain. And in fact, if someone is getting off on pain, they're not going to be effective at all. So maybe you're now thinking, how can I incorporate a bit of pain play into my BDSM practice? I think it's very important to remember those founding principles we talked about in the earlier episodes. Everything needs to be consented to, everything needs to be negotiated, and everything has boundaries and limits set around them. So once you've done those things, talk to your partner, consented to what activities are going to take place, consented to where that starts and where that ends, then you're kind of ready to start playing with pain, let's say. Now, my favorite advice to newbies is start softer than soft and slower than slow. Because if you think about it, it is very easy to increase, especially with intensity. It's quite hard to go the other way. So when you start light as a feather. Check in with your partner, see how they're feeling. And remember, you've got your safe words for a reason, so that if it does get a little bit too intense, you call your orange, you call your red. But also, it's not just words. And I want to emphasize this. We do have safe words, and of course, they're encouraged to be used at all possible moments. However, as dominants, we also need to take the responsibility for a scene and the fact that we're in the role play of leading. And part of that role play is we're also the caretaker of that scene, which means we need to be taking care of our submissive who has entrusted us with this massive kink or BDSM or practice of theirs. And that means being able to read this person. And it's a very important part of my job and something I've really learned and honed as part of my craft is to read my client. A lot of clients or submissives will refrain from using their safe words because it can be seen as a bit of a failure or they're trying to push themselves to the next level. But it is your responsibility as a dominant to see if it's going too far and to know when to call it. So just remember those guiding principles: softer than soft, slower than slow, and you'll be fine. And I also think it's nice to remember that a lot of people grow and learn a lot about themselves through BDSM. And while we spend a lot of this episode talking about pain, and even though it is interpreted in different ways for different people, it's also nice to know that there's a lot of people who have had positive experiences through working with pain. I know someone who comes in for spankings, and it's what I would call cathartic corporal punishment, where they find that through the spanking, that actually releases a lot of emotions for them, and they're able to literally sob it out. But after the end of the session, they say they feel light and they feel like drained of all that stress and that maybe heaviness that they had on them prior to walking in that session. Another one from a mental aspect, I have a client who comes from quite a strict religious background. He is actually bisexual and likes to dress up in women's clothes, and it's just not accepted in his family or in his society as well. And he has a lot of shame and pain around that in his everyday life. He comes to sessions here and literally we spend the whole session just dressing up in clothes and lingerie and doing our makeup and pretending we're two girls at a sleepover party. And it brings him so much joy because this is his time to zone out of his everyday world where he's not allowed to be himself and really come alive and be who he is deep inside. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a understanding on how pain is really not a negative thing as sometimes society would have us think, but it can be a really positive experience for many people. So we've actually demystified a couple of myths around BDSM and pain today. Interestingly, next week, I'll be busting the top 5 BDSM myths. And in the meantime, get your kink on.